kick off, Paul. Thank you.
Yes. Yep, I'm okay. My name's Paul Jennings. I work for Social Farms and Gardens on a project called Camagüev, which is about widening accessibility to community gardening and community-supported agriculture. I did my first permaculture design course with Patrick Whitfield in 1992, and I've been working in organic growing and permaculture since 1996. I've held a diploma in permaculture design since about 2002, I think, and in the last few years I've taught quite a lot of permaculture design courses. Doorbell ringing. Taught quite a lot of permaculture design courses and permaculture related courses. I was just at the Paramythi Cymru gathering near Abergavenny and led a workshop on inclusivity and accessibility permaculture. So I'm very aware that there's a lot of permaculture knowledge in this virtual room. So I want you to all know that I'm not being dogmatic about any of this. And hopefully we can turn it into a conversation and harvest some of that knowledge when I've gone through these slides. Excuse me, hopefully there'll be something here to interest all of you, no matter how long you've been involved or interested in permaculture. So permaculture design for community gardens is a really exciting topic for me at the moment, because I am increasingly passionate about the role that community gardens play in our society, in our settlements, and in our food sovereignty. Working for social farms and gardens in 2024 has got to me. So I am a community garden zealot these days. So what role can permaculture design play in community gardens is the topic of this talk, really. And I just want to make some broad suggestions around that. I can't talk about everything that is in permaculture in 15 or 20 minutes or however long it's going to take me to shoot through these slides. But I'll try and cover the main points that are of interest to me at the moment and see if I can spark a conversation. So I made some notes for the slides just in case my brain was too foggy to just talk off the cuff. So you see here a picture of a forest garden, plant guild system, really, which a lot of people would associate immediately with permaculture. Notice in this picture, each element is tied through a beneficial relationship to other elements in the system. And I particularly like that idea with regard to our community gardens. Principle maximize beneficial relationships is key to permaculture, and of course might be seen as the mother of all principles. In fact, I think Bill Mollison probably called it the mother of all principles. So maximizing beneficial relationships is central to the way we grow, the way we garden, but also to how good community and good community gardens run, as well as they might. And so the other thing to notice about a diagram like this is relative location. And I think another Mollison-ism is that relative location is sometimes enough. Getting things in the right place, sometimes enough to generate that impetus of beneficial relationships, to get everything going. So the classic example is ducks and ponds, I suppose. But windbreaks and productive fruit systems in this diagram is a really good example as well. And I'm sure there are social examples around communities and community gardens that we could come up with later. So I'm going to make the case for permaculture design in community gardens precisely because permaculture is not just about communities of plants. So this isn't just going to be a talk about horticulture or gardening, but I'm going to allude to it rather a lot so that we can talk really about community and community gardens. Communities that include people as well as plants and animals. Let's see if I can get the slide to work. No, that's not working. Why isn't it working? Oh, now I've gone too far forward. Okay, so what even is permaculture? None of this will come as a surprise to any of you who've encountered permaculture, even if it's only an introductory course you've been on. So permaculture addresses many related disciplines across food growing, land management, building, craft, and organization and community building. So it's multidisciplinary. As an aside, that's one of the reasons why permaculture and permaculturalists often have problems addressing themselves to educational institutions, and to local authorities, because it's not as easy as saying I'm an ecologist or I'm a horticulturalist. Permaculture, at least on one level, is the realm of the generalist. But its base, permaculture, is an ethical system. And any of you who've been on an intro to permaculture or done the PDC will be familiar with the triad of earth care, people care, and what these days is most often expressed as fair shares. But I quite like limits. We can talk about culture and limits later on if people are interested in that. Permaculture is influenced by ancient and indigenous thought, as diverse as Buddhism and Taoism, or the second generation's principle of Native American beliefs or practice. But it's also a system that draws heavily on the science of ecology, particularly forest ecology. Particularly interested in how systems become self-sustaining through the cycling of energy. So how human systems might mirror or imitate ecosystems in that regard. So it's focused on meeting human needs as part of a healthy ecosystem. This chap is Andrew Millison, whose YouTube work is well worth looking into. There's a link there, which isn't shared terribly usefully on this slide, but I can share it if people are interested. It's to this video actually. So if you were to search on YouTube for Andrew Millison, when you design with people in mind, community will emerge. I'm sure you'll come to this video. Permaculture is often described as permanent agriculture, but I think it's much more useful actually, and I think particularly in terms of community gardens, to think of permaculture as permanent culture, or a culture that thinks about permanence or its own survival. We all know that community gardens are great for people. I'm so lucky in my work that I visit these places packed with positive people doing amazing things. It's a real privilege. But intentional design of these places can optimize their impact and change the world, right? And the only way we can ever change the world, one person coming through the gates of our community garden at a time. This refers back to that notion of permanent culture, this slide really. I'm gonna just put this out there and say that all gardeners specialize in love and abundance. It might not be true of people who just mow their lawn and use weed killer on everything, but most gardeners that I've been lucky enough to know specialize in love and abundance, sharing their food, sharing the plants they grow, sharing the seeds they save, and sharing knowledge. And permaculture design gives us tools to drive our projects in that direction towards abundance. And if you look at the work of the Australian permaculturalist Jeff Lawton online, he talks a lot about these moments at which our gardens arrive at abundance. That might look quite different for community gardens than, for example, my home garden, where I'm mostly interested in the abundance of raspberries that I have at the moment, for example. In a community garden, it might look like 1,000 people turning up to the Clutter Community Garden plant sale, for example, which feels like abundance to them. And it's a matter of community support designed for, So the vital importance of meeting human needs has to be understood in this context. And David Holmgren's principle, take a yield, reminds us that when our projects meet our needs, they become resilient. So this is really about dependence and how we design community gardens that then we become dependent upon in the best way. So we become dependent upon the gardens to meet our needs. It might be in food, it might be in companionship or support, and then we come to depend upon each other. And these interdependencies are enormously powerful. And that's what Millison means in that quote that was on the last slide. When you design with people in mind, community will emerge. So I keep talking about design. The value of a design process is a part of this story. Permaculture design concentrates on observation, which you'll sometimes hear referred to kind of cryptically as listening to the land, listening to one another, listening to yourself. In fact, Patrick Whitfield wrote an excellent book called Listening to the Landscape, about understanding landscape processes, but it can equally be applied to any garden or community or street that might be in need of a garden. So we observe, and then we embark upon the process of collaborative decision making. And that's true even if we're designing something just on our own, which in my opinion isn't an ideal situation to be in. That's true of most things that people do. But even if we're on our own, we are still collaborating with the wider environment, with the land, with other people whose lives touch upon what we're doing. So this deepening process of engagement is covered very nicely in our colleague Jasmine Dale's book, Permaculture, the Permaculture Design Companion, which is a step-by-step approach to applying permaculture design ideas. And the design process deepens our understanding of site and of one another. And actually, that's what I want to suggest, that deepening understanding of one another is central to whether our projects succeed or fail, whether community gardens develop that critical mass, that liveliness that carries them on, whether they're places which are perhaps dominated by one or two people, or whose lives depend upon the energies of just one or two individuals. Yeah, I think I've covered that slide. Okay, so permaculture design is an iterative design process, which sounds very technical. It isn't really. All it means is that design is an ongoing process. And I think you'll recognize that from the projects that you're involved in, that the best laid plans of mice and men and all that. No plan survives contact with the real world. And so we have to replan. And this is just about saying that in terms of a design discipline. So we learn from what works. Let me let Les in. We learn from what works and we learn from what doesn't. I can certainly say in my career as a grower and a designer and working on farms and in projects involving other people, I have learned a great deal from the things I've got wrong. Often stories that I don't rejoice in telling and retelling, but nevertheless very strong learning experiences. Guided by our tools and ethics, and then we adapt our plans and go around again and around again, always. So it's not as if a designer has an idea, creates that idea, and then it's perfectly created. That idea must be adapted as people and land change. So quickly to unpack some of the terms, maybe it will be useful to unpack some of the terms in this diagram. Principles I've mentioned a few times. I mentioned maximize beneficial relationships earlier. If you make the mistake of going online and saying list permaculture design principles, the lists now go on and on and on. Probably the best place to start is with David Holmgren's 12 principles of permaculture design. It's the ones which are most often referred to these days. It's really a toolkit, set of tools. Resources and limits, what do we have on each site or in each project in terms of the people or socially around the project or ecologically, or people refer to as biological resources. I want to highlight this because I often come across people who want to use permaculture design or who want to launch a project. And one of the resources it's easy to miss in our examination of the foundations of a project is our own resource, what we have to give, what we can provide, how many hours in the day or the week we can put in something. And we have to survey ourselves with brutal honesty in that regard as well. It's all very well saying, oh, I want to create this, I want to create that, or as a group, let's create this or that, let's create that. If we don't have the resources, we have to be kind to ourselves and recognize what they are, then we're not going to be able to realize the project. Zones and sectors are spatial and energetic tools used by permaculture designers. They're very simple, but I can't unpack them very much here. Really, zonal design or zonal analysis says start near and start on a small scale. And sectoral design says fit your design into a wider landscape that's going to be full of wild energies. And those wild energies will impact wild energies, which those will impact upon our projects. So it could be the wind, That's the most obvious example, perhaps the wind that blows through the site. It could be water that flows across the site unexpectedly. It could be people coming through. It could be squirrels. Um, I say that from experience. And the scale of permanence just refers to the fact that some things are easier to change than others. It's easier to address the life in our soil than it is on our own site to address, for example, the climate. We know that what we do on our site will influence the climate, but the time scales and the impacts are much longer, and the impact's much smaller than, let's say, improving life in our soils. So I hope that makes sense in that regard. Design is a process then of learning. I could have just put that and ignored all this technical stuff. When you design and implement, you learn, you remain humble, then you go back and you do it again, hopefully getting better, closer to meeting the needs of everyone involved and of the land involved. So here's Sarah. It's not all about no dig, and it's not all about bits of old carpet, which certainly used to be the idea when allotment committees used to be outraged by the idea of a permaculturalist having an allotment. Permaculture is not a list of techniques, is the takeaway from this slide, but that's the way most people approach it. I once had a conversation with someone in France, and they said, "Oh, yeah, I know about permaculture. It's about using paillage, right? It's about using a straw mulch." And that was it for them. That was like, oh, I've seen a permaculture garden. Everything's mulched with straw. But those of us who've tried to grow potatoes under straw in the west of Cymru, permaculture isn't always about using a straw mulch. So permaculture is a design discipline as opposed to a list of techniques. It won't necessarily, or rather, it will necessarily give rise to different manifestations on different sites with different people. If every permaculture site you visit looks the same, we're probably using more inputs, more energy than we should be. We're probably paying less attention to people and to place than we should be. We're imposing an idea on sites, different sites and different people, rather than going through a design process. That's not to say that many of the techniques most commonly associated with permaculture wouldn't be useful in many community gardens. It just means that if someone starts a conversation about permaculture by talking about herb spirals and deep mulches, they probably haven't put much thought into design process. And it's the design process that allows us to work this partnership of land and people and the surrounding social and ecological space. Yeah, so I mean, I could go through some of these. No dig, I would imagine we're all familiar with, and anyone that's been on a permaculture course, certainly one of my permaculture courses, will be familiar with all the arguments for not digging and all the arguments for digging. I was having a conversation with a CSA grower today about an agreement he's made with a neighbouring farmer to grow some potatoes and how horrified he is at the prospect of having to, I suppose, work with the farmer in terms of plough culture, returning to plough culture on a broad scale. Plant guilds, like the Association of Plants on the first slide, can be very useful, maximizing productivity in small spaces, reducing inputs, building in ecosystem resilience. Forest gardens. I know there's at least one forest gardener in the room. I'm sure there are more who visited forest gardens. Digging swales. Swales are part of an overall system for watershed rehabilitation, which might not be useful in most community garden scales. You never know. A sloping community garden in Swansea probably could do well with a swale. Cabin living, I only say that because I live in a cabin and it's part of a permaculture design. And mulch, mulch, mulch. Mulch can be very useful. It can also be catastrophic if you use too much mulch at the wrong time of year when the soil is cold. And many more quirky and useful things. But permaculture is not, to reiterate, a list of techniques. So one of the great things about permaculture for community gardens is that it has low barriers to entry. In particular, permaculture specializes in an approach which mirrors or is inspired by natural succession, gradual change, and a growth of complexity. This is actually unlike the way most people approach garden projects. because we are an instant result kind of culture, um, throwing resources at something until we get exactly the response from the situation that we want. Um, in permaculture, each stage builds on the previous one. We can try and accelerate that succession, like accelerating natural succession by tree planting, by planting plant guilds. But essentially, I think this might come across as a little bit prescriptive, something to talk about. Permaculture gardens start with saying, okay, let's look at our composting system. Let's produce our own compost on site if we can. Let's set up a nursery for suitable plants, regionally adapted, that are going to meet our needs that we've previously identified in a design process. So I'm always excited if I turn up at a project and that's what they're emphasizing. Um, I'm not excited to see expensive planters abandoned a year after a garden has been set up. I'm excited to see a project that starts with composting and a plant nursery. That speaks to me of forethought and design. We start with building soil life with biomass. And do you know that might mean arriving at a site and being grateful that it's covered in things that most people would see as overgrown or weedy or messy. I have a friend who works in a conservation organization, and he quite often posts on Instagram the great work they've done on the weekend, clearing away semi-wild systems, which are actually soil building, soil restorative, and habitat. And I avoid commenting. I don't like his posts on Instagram when he does that either, but I avoid commenting. Our gardens as permaculture designers adapt to local conditions. This goes back to what I was saying about not imposing the same kind of design on every site. And we try to make the least change for the most impact, which is hard. It's difficult, especially when everyone wants to make a big impact. We learn more when we try to make the least impact or the least change for the most impact, rather. Sorry, words in a muddle. What might that look like? I'll give you some examples. Arrive at a site where there are nettles, start eating nettles. I think that's a good strategy. Apart from the fact that nettles are one of the most valuable crops that I have here, and they're a companion for our species and have been for a very long time. Chop and drop soil building, make the least change for the most impact, and grow more perennial plants in beds and gardens. It's a really nice strategy because it thinks about the garden going forward. We might not be in the garden in a year. Okay, we might not be here next spring, but the perennial plants will, and they'll still be looking after the soil life. So yes, low barriers to entry, a kind of garden building that works with nature rather than against. Some people have their doubts about permaculture, and I understand that. Maybe not in this room, because I'm sort of thinking maybe lots of permaculturalists have come into this talk, but permaculture gardens can seem untidy, going back to the horror of allotment committees. Often there are no distinct rows. My partner quite likes gardens with straight rows of vegetables, and I have increasingly grown fewer and fewer vegetables in straight rows over the years. Polycultures abound, and polycultures can be complex. They can be challenging to the way we garden. And perennial crops are often mixed with annuals in permaculture systems. I was watching a Jeff Lawton video about a permaculture project in Hungary last night, and they were growing a Three Sisters guild with hemp as a fiber crop, Robinia pseudacacia to fix nitrogen, and what was the third one? I think they were growing some herbal crop underneath it. Excuse me, my mind's gone. But a mix of perennials and annuals. So permaculture gardens often resemble wild systems. It's not what people expect from a productive garden, and often people have to look at it differently to see that it is a super productive system if it's designed well and if there's a well aimed human intervention in the system to keep it productive for our needs, of course. Yeah, these are some ways in which permaculture can be implemented, not the only ways. So a second level of concern and doubt might be that permaculture is too demanding. So I'm going to lay out what is quite a fundamentalist argument here. One of the things that will probably people who aren't familiar with permaculture or the discussions that permaculturalists have would seem like an extreme point of view. It can seem very demanding, at least. So it might be that it's not that we need to change the land into the kind of horticulture that we expect in community gardens, but maybe we need to let the land change us through observation of the land once, and then we change. This is part of the eat more nettles argument that I've reached with my permaculture. People do shape the land that they live in, and that's fine. But cultures that endure also adapt to what the land has to offer. Low input and low carbon systems, which mimic nature, look even less like gardens and farms than most contemporary permaculture plots do. And culture is built through communities listening to their land, and over time adapting, listening to the land. So I'm lucky enough to live in Cymru. Cymru probably should mostly be temperate rainforest. I would consider it quite a good long-term success if most gardens in Cymru, to some extent, met human needs whilst looking more and more like temperate rainforests. That's going to be very different if the climate you're adapting to is that part of Essex that gets less rain than North Africa. It's not going to look like a temperate rainforest garden. The challenge of meeting one's needs from a temperate rainforest garden is one that I'm not up to. But as David Holmgren reminds us, permaculture is a multi-generational journey. So permaculture is a tool for every community garden. Permaculture is not just a set of land management skills. It sets out to forge a new relationship between people, between communities and the land. Community gardens are creative places where together we can dream and design our common future. And I think that is the point I would most like to get across in conclusion. This is the last slide. That when we come together and we design, intentionally design, rather than bumbling through, if you like, with good intentions, but without design, when we come together to design, we begin to build those communities in a democratic way, in a way that respects everyone's voice, in a way that aims self-consciously to meet everyone's needs. And this is really important in a world of social and ecological uncertainty, an urgent task, in my opinion, in terms of food production. And permaculture design is made for this. It might not be the only system that's made for this, but properly employed, permaculture design, I think, is in its absolute element in community design rather than trapped in individual gardens or the gardens of separate families. And I think seeing permaculture design as a community tool is what the initiators and the most exciting thinkers in permaculture would most want. So that's it. I shall stop sharing my screen, I guess, and maybe Alison will unmute you all.
Thanks so much, Paul. Go and get your hot lemon. Lovely. Thanks so much. That lots of food for thought. There's nothing come up on the chat, but we've got plenty of time now if anyone wanted to reflect on anything or ask any questions of Paul or anyone else in the room. I'm gonna stop the recording if that's okay with everyone. I might just pause it just in case anything particularly of note comes up, so I'll just do that.